Okay, we turn our attention now to the organs of the female reproductive system, which are specialized to produce and maintain the female sex cells, which are called oocytes. Most of us refer to them as eggs. To transport these cells to the site of fertilization, to provide a favorable environment for developing offspring, to move that offspring to the outside of the female body, and to produce female sex hormones. The primary sex organs, or gonads, of the female system are the ovaries. They produce the female sex cells and sex hormones. The accessory sex organs of the female reproductive system are both internal and external reproductive organs. So, taking a look here. First thing they label here at the upper left is a ureter, which is, of course, bringing urine down from the kidneys to the bladder, which is shown here. And sitting on top of the bladder is the uterus. Now, I'll caution you again to be careful, although I don't actually require you to spell things. Well, you will on a lab activity, but you'll get a chance to correct that. But you notice Uterus, Ureter. I mean, a lot of the same letters, and people have mixed these up or misspell things. We also have the urethra, which is, of course, the tube that leads from the bladder to the outside to expel urine. So be thoughtful about the spelling of these things. Now, the uterus, we also know that as the womb. And here is the neck of the uterus, which is known as the cervix. Cervical, of course. Vertebrae are the vertebrae in the neck. So cervic has to do with neck. So here's that label. Here we see the ovaries, and it's right here and labeled over here to the left. My mouse doesn't want to move that way right now. Here you see the fimbriae, the finger-looking extensions of the uterine tube, which is here and leads down and connects to the uterus. These are sometimes called fallopian tubes, sometimes called oviducts. If I move this up a little bit. So here is the, they're labeling it the pubic symphysis, and that plays a more important role in females than in males. You should recall that the pubic symphysis is the fibrous tissue that joins the two parts of the pubic arch. That has to give, has to be able to stretch and move during childbirth. Here we see the clitoris, the bulk of that embedded here in the fatty tissue. Now that's the mons pubis, the pubic mound that lies over the pubic bones. Then we have the two lips, or labia, the labium minus and labium majus. Now, labium is singular. If we take the pair of those, then we have labia. So you have the minor lips on the inside surrounded by the labia majora, or labium majus, on the outside. Here's the opening to the vagina, which the vagina extends up and surrounds the ends of the cervix. And if we take a different view here and look at this in cross section, this will be the front. So this is the mons pubis here. And there you see the ischium, part of the pelvic girdle. The femur here. And there you can see the ureter. So this is the rectum back here, the uterus here, and the urinary bladder here. So they've cut this before the uterus comes up and folds over the top of the bladder. So this cut is at just the right level for us to see into both of those. So the ovaries are solid, ovoid or egg-shaped structures that measure about 3.5 centimeters in length, 2 centimeters in width, and only 1 centimeter thick. 3.5 centimeters is about 1.5 inches, and 1 centimeter is about, I always use the pinky fingernail as a rough guide for 1 centimeter. The ovaries are in shallow depressions on each side of the lateral wall of the pelvic cavity. Those depressions are called the ovarian fossa. They are connected. They have a suspensory ligament of the ovary that holds it. Here, this uterine tube has been retracted or pulled over to the side. You can see where it would normally run, right up against the bone. Here's the ovarian ligament, and embedded in here is the round ligament. We'll read about these in just a moment. This is the uterus. And here's the broad ligament. So they're going to be telling us about those and what they do shortly. And in fact, here it is, the attachments. Several structures help hold the ovary in position. There's a fold of peritoneum with ovarian blood vessels and nerves that attaches each ovary to the largest of these, which is the broad ligament, and it's also attached to the uterine tubes and the uterus. Then there's a small fold of the peritoneum called the suspensory ligament that holds the ovary at its upper end. It also surrounds ovarian blood vessels and nerves. At its lower end, the ovary is attached to the uterus by a rounded cord-like thickening of the broad ligament called the ovarian ligament. Ovaries in a female, like testes in a male, originate masses of tissue posterior to the parietal peritoneum near the kidneys. But during development, they descend to locations just below the brim of the pelvis, and there they're attached to the lateral pelvic wall. Tissues of an ovary can be subdivided into two rather indistinct regions, the inner medulla and the outer cortex. We've seen those terms applied to many organs. The ovarian medulla is mostly loose connective tissue with relatively large blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerve fibers. The cortex consists of more compact tissue that has a granular appearance due to tiny masses of cells called ovarian follicles. And the oocytes, or eggs, develop within those follicles. Now, this drawing, this causes problems sometimes. In fact, I believe they've changed it a little bit. Let me look for something here. Yeah, this illustration here is new to this edition of the text, and not the one that I was thinking it was. So, several things shown here. Developing follicles. Now, these could be anywhere on the ovary. They just tried to draw all the different possibilities on this one. Developing follicles here. A tunica albuginea, which we will talk about a little bit later. Alb, meaning white. Here's a corpus luteum. Here is a smaller developing corpus luteum. Corpus means body. Lutea refers to yellow. This is a temporary gland that will develop. Here we see a secondary oocyte being ovulated. And again, we loosely refer to secondary oocyte as an egg. Here we see a mature follicle with that secondary oocyte ready to be ovulated. Okay. There's a layer of cuboidal epithelium that covers the free surface of the ovary. And just beneath this epithelium, there's a layer of dense connective tissue called, I told you we'd see this 2 or 3 times. This is the 3rd time now, tunica albuginea. Okay. During prenatal development, all right, so ladies, when you were inside your mother's womb, primordial germ cells called oogonia divide by mitosis. Remember, mitosis, you're taking diploid cells and dividing them into 2. So you have 2 diploid cells. This produces more oogonia. The oogonia develop into primary oocytes. Each primary oocyte is closely surrounded by a single layer of flattened epithelial cells called follicular cells to form something called a primordial follicle. Early in development, the primary oocytes begin to undergo meiosis. Now again, this is while a female child is still in her mother's womb. The process halts and doesn't continue until the individual reaches puberty. Once the primordial follicles appear, no new ones form. Instead, the number of primary oocytes in the ovaries will steadily decline as many of the primary oocytes degenerate. Out of 6 to 7 million primary oocytes formed in the embryonic ovaries, only 1 million or so remain at birth, and only about 300,000 are left once a girl reaches puberty. Out of these 300,000, probably fewer than 300 or 400 oocytes will be released from the ovary during the female's reproductive life. So you think if we're going to have a monthly cycle, once a month, that's 12 times a year. And if that were to last 40 years, that would be 480 oocytes being released. So that would be kind of at the upper end. I mean, that 40 years, from 10 to 50. So anyway, so this 6 or 7 million primary oocytes, that is in a girl's ovaries before she is even born. So timing here, very different than in the male system. Okay, as far as the internal organs, first we have the uterine tubes or fallopian tubes or oviducts, suspended by portions of the broad ligament, open near the ovaries. They're about 10 centimeters long, less than a centimeter in diameter, and they pass toward the middle to the uterus. They penetrate the wall of the uterus and open into the uterine cavity. This provides a pathway for the secondary oocyte to get from the ovary to the uterus. Now, I had a misconception in my youth. It wasn't until I took an anatomy class that I understood this. I somehow pictured the ovaries as being hollow and the uterine tube being connected to it, and there being an opening into the ovary so that the egg's produced on the inside of the ovary and comes down the fallopian tube. But in reality, the oocytes, the secondary oocytes, or eggs in slang terms, they're released off the outside of the ovary. And the fallopian tube opens up beside the ovary like a funnel. In fact, that funnel structure is the infundibulum. It partially encircles the ovary. On its margin, the infundibulum has irregular branched extensions called fimbriae. And although the infundibulum generally doesn't touch the ovary, one of the extensions connects directly to the ovary. This is why some cases of ovarian cancer actually begin in the cells of the fimbriae. So, if I can scroll this up a little bit, here's the ovary. The oocyte is released off of it and has to find its way into this funnel-shaped opening to make its way down the fallopian tube into the uterus, the womb. Okay. The wall of the uterine tube has an inner mucosal layer, a middle muscular layer, which is made of smooth muscle, and an outer covering of peritoneum. The muscle layer is drawn into longitudinal folds and lined with simple columnar epithelium cells, some of which have cilia. The epithelium secretes mucus. The cilia beat toward the uterus. So these actions help to cause the fluid to flow down the uterine tube to help draw the secondary oocyte and its expelled follicular fluid into the infundibulum after ovulation. The ciliary action and the peristaltic contractions of the muscle layer aid the transport of the secondary oocyte down the uterine tube. And fertilization occurs in the uterine tube. That's another kind of a misconception, I think. I know that I had it. So the secondary oocyte is released or ovulated off the ovary and enters the fallopian tube, and fertilization is going to occur somewhere in that tube because of the timing. By the time the secondary oocyte travels all the way down the fallopian tube to the uterus, it would take longer than that secondary oocyte is going to survive. So it has to get fertilized within 24, maybe 48 hours at the most. And that means it's going to happen in the tube. All right. The uterus, a hollow, muscular, shaped like an inverted pear. It receives the embryo that develops from an oocyte that got fertilized in the uterine tube and sustains its development. The broad ligament attaches to the ovaries and uterine tubes, extends from the lateral walls of the uterus to the pelvic walls and floor, creates a drape across the top of the pelvic cavity. I don't remember where I was. I had to pause and go see about my dog. I believe I was right here. Flattened band of tissue within the broad ligament called the round ligament connects the upper end of the uterus to the anterior pelvic wall. The round ligaments course through the inguinal canal and attach to subcutaneous tissue of the labia majora. Cardinal ligaments attach the lower part of the uterus to the lateral walls of the pelvis, and the uterosacral ligaments attach the uterus to the sacrum in the back. Size of the uterus changes greatly during pregnancy. That is an understatement. In non-pregnant adult state, 7 centimeters long, that's less than 3 inches. 5 centimeters wide, that's right at 2 inches. And 2.5 centimeters in diameter, that's 1 inch. Uterus is located medially in the anterior part of the pelvic cavity, superior to the vagina, and usually bends forward over the top of the bladder. And so something, if you've ever been pregnant, you can relate to what that's going to mean. With that, with the uterus growing, expand, with a child growing in it, and it's sitting on top of the bladder, doesn't give the bladder a lot of room to expand and fill. So bathroom visits become much more frequent. The upper 2/3 of the uterus is called the body. It has a dome-shaped top called the fundus. We've seen that term before. The stomach has a dome top called a fundus. It's joined by the uterine tubes, which enter its wall at the broadest part. The lower 1/3 of the uterus is called the cervix, or the neck. The tubular part extends down into the upper part of the vagina. The cervix surrounds the opening, which is called the cervical orifice, through which the uterus opens to the vagina. A pap smear test identifies changes in cells sampled from the cervix that indicate localized precancerous condition called carcinoma in situ, on site. That's the kind of literal translation there. Let's see. And you're probably familiar with HPV, human papillomavirus. Papilloma is a term, basically it's like a wart. So the HPV, human papillomavirus, causes these, and those have a tendency to develop into cancer. All right, uterine wall is thick and has three layers. The inner lining is called the endometrium. Um, it is covered with columnar epithelium and contains abundant tubular glands. And the muscle layer is called the myometrium. Um, Primarily smooth muscle, which of course that means it is under involuntary control. It's during menstrual cycles and pregnancy, the endometrium and the myometrium change extensively. And then the outer covering is the perimetrium. That's around the outside. It's an outer serosal layer, covers the body of the uterus and part of the cervix. The vagina is a fibromuscular tube about 9 centimeters long, extending from the uterus to the outside. It conveys uterine secretions. It'll receive an erect penis during intercourse and provide a passageway for the offspring to exit the body during birth. It extends up and back into the pelvic cavity, posterior to or behind the bladder and the urethra, anterior to the rectum, and is attached to those structures with connective tissue. The upper 1/4 is separated from the rectum by a pouch called the rectouterine pouch. The tubular vagina also surrounds the end of the cervix. The recesses between the vaginal wall and the cervix are called fornices. One is a singular form of that word, is a fornix. Fornices are clinically important because they're thin-walled and allow a physician to palpate the internal abdominopelvic organs. Also, the posterior fornix provides surgical access to the peritoneal cavity through the vagina. The vaginal orifice, partially closed with a thin membrane of connective tissue and stratified squamous epithelium called the hymen. A central opening of varying size allows uterine and vaginal secretions to pass to the outside. There are 3 layers to the vaginal wall. The inner is the mucosal layer, and like most other openings to the outside of the body, it's stratified squamous epithelium. It's drawn into longitudinal and transverse ridges called vaginal rugae. Remember that the stomach, when empty, the walls of it on the inside fold up, and the resulting ridges are called rugae. This layer lacks mucus glands. The mucus in the lumen of the vagina comes from glands of the cervix and vestibular glands that are at the mouth or the opening of the vagina. The middle layer is muscular. It is a lot of smooth muscle in an outer circular layer and an inner longitudinal layer. Smooth muscle can stretch to accommodate a penis during intercourse or a child during childbirth. At the lower end of the vagina, there's a thin band of striated muscle, which of course striated skeletal muscle is striated, so that's under voluntary control. It helps close the vaginal opening. There is another voluntary muscle called the bulbospongiosus that is mainly responsible for closing the orifice. The outer layer is the fibrous layer, or the adventitia. Consists of dense connective tissue interlaced with elastic fibers that attaches the vagina to the surrounding organs. The external accessory reproductive organs include the labia majora, that's the plural form again, the labia minora, the clitoris, and the vestibular glands. The structures that surround the openings of the urethra and the vagina comprise the vulva. So overall, we're seeing here the vulva. So here is the clitoris. Now they're going to use a term here, and the term escapes me, so I'm going to have to wait until we get to it. Here is the mons pubis, again the pubic mound, if you will, which is adipose tissue covering the pubic arch. Here's the opening to the urethra. The labium majus, the major or larger lips that surround the labium minus, and again there are 2, one on each side. The plural form to talk about both at once again would be labia majora or labia minora. Here's the vaginal orifice, the vestibule, and there are vestibular glands, which are also known as Bartholin's glands, that will secrete some fluid. Not labeled here is the perineum, the area between the vulva and the anus. So the labia majora enclose and protect the other external reproductive organs. They are homologous structures, similar in origin and function to the scrotum of the male. There's the term I couldn't come up with a minute ago, homologous. They're composed of rounded folds of adipose with a thin layer of smooth muscle covered by skin. On the outside, the skin has hair, sweat glands, and sebaceous glands. On the inside, it is thinner and hairless. The labia majora lie close together. They are separated longitudinally by a cleft called the pudendal cleft, which includes the urethral and vaginal openings. At the anterior, at the front end, they merge and form a medial rounded elevation of adipose called the mons pubis, which lies over the pubic symphysis, and they taper out toward the back and merge near the anus. The labia minora are flattened longitudinal folds between the labia majora. They are composed of connective tissue, richly supplied with blood vessels, which imparts a pinkish appearance. Stratified squamous epithelium covers the tissue. Once again, openings to the outside of the body are almost always stratified squamous epithelium. Toward the back, they merge with the labia majora, and in the front, they converge and form a hood-like covering around the clitoris. The clitoris, visible as a small projection at the anterior end of the vulva between the labia minora, typically a couple of centimeters long and a half centimeter in diameter. Most of that is embedded in the surrounding tissue. The clitoris is homologous to the penis in males and has a similar structure. It has two columns of erectile tissue called corpora cavernosa. There's a septum that separates these columns, and they're covered with dense connective tissue. And at the root of the clitoris, the corpora cavernosa diverge and form the crura, same as with the penis, which in turn attach to the sides of the pubic arch. At the anterior end of the clitoris, there's a small mass of erectile tissue forming a glans, which is richly supplied with sensory nerve fibers. So when we talk about being homologous, basically it means that the same tissue that can form a clitoris in a female can form a penis in a male. And this is controlled largely by hormones. And the encoding for those hormones is located, for males, it's on the Y chromosome. So if you have a Y chromosome, you'll have the genes that will trigger the hormones at the appropriate time during development and cause that tissue to develop as a penis. The labia majora in a male would develop into the scrotum. In the absence of that hormonal control, in other words, if you don't have a Y chromosome, then instead you develop the clitoris and the labia. So it's the default development. So the labia minora enclose a space called the vestibule. The vagina opens into the posterior part of the vestibule, the urethra in the middle, just in front of the vagina, and about an inch, 2.5 centimeters posterior to the glands of the clitoris. We saw the vestibular glands, also known as Bartholin's glands, which are comparable to the bulbourethral glands of males. They're on either side of the vaginal opening. Their ducts open into the vestibule near the lateral margins of the vaginal orifice. Beneath the mucosa of the vestibule, on either side, there's a mass of vascular erectile tissue homologous to the corpus spongiosum in males. They're called vestibular bulbs. The vagina and urethra separate the vestibular bulbs, which extend forward from the level of the vaginal opening to the clitoris. So these will cause the lips to swell. They will engorge with blood during sexual activity. So erectile tissues in the clitoris and around the vaginal entrance respond to sexual stimulation. And similar to what we saw in males, parasympathetic impulses from the sacral part of the spinal cord cause release of nitric oxide that dilates the arteries that carry blood into the erectile tissues. So the blood inflow increases, the tissues swell up, the blood outflow is restricted by the swelling, and so all these tissues, all these erectile tissues will swell. So the vagina will expand and elongate. If the stimulation is sufficiently intense, parasympathetic impulses stimulate the vestibular glands to secrete mucus, to moisten and lubricate the tissues. Mucus secretion will continue during intercourse to help prevent irritation of tissues that might occur if the vagina remained dry. The clitoris has abundant sensory nerve fibers, especially sensitive to local stimulation. And the culmination of the stimulation is orgasm, which again they describe as a pleasurable sensation of physiological and psychological release. Just prior to orgasm, tissues of the outer third of the vagina will engorge and swell to increase friction on the penis during intercourse. Orgasm will initiate a series of reflexes involving the sacral and lumbar portions of the spinal cord. And these reflexes cause muscles of the perineum and the walls of the uterus and the uterine tubes to contract. And these contractions form a sort of a peristaltic motion to help transport semen with sperm cells through the reproductive tract toward the upper ends of the uterine tubes. Those muscular contractions of the uterus are also amplified by the prostaglandins that are in the semen. So that will cause muscle contractions in the uterus to again help push the sperm up toward the fallopian tubes. All right, I believe that's it for this section.